Okay, so today's lecture we're going to look at what I'm calling From Cosmology to Morality, Interpreting Mythological Symbols in King Lear. Now, the purpose of this lecture is to provide a framework for looking at the issues of morality in King Lear, for analyzing the characters in terms of how they fit a particular moral framework within King Lear, and what are kind of the clues, or what I'm going to be calling markers, of morality that we can apply to the different characters to determine where they kind of fall on this morality dichotomy. What we'll see is that in the play, there are certain elements that are clearly defined as good and certain elements that are clearly defined as bad. And we'll see many of the characters fall very nicely into one or the other camps. And what we kind of want to ask is, okay, what is the criteria that we want to be using in order to determine who is a good character, quote unquote, and who is a bad character or evil character? I'm going to try not to use the word evil because of the strength of the connotation, but it might be an appropriate term for some of these characters in this play. They do some very dastardly things. And eventually we'll look at some of the characters in more depth and see how maybe they don't fit quite so cleanly into these categories. But for the most part, we can kind of label a character good or a character bad. And we want to be discussing, well, how do we go about determining that criteria for those labels? And what I'm going to outline is a structure that is based in essentially a mythological archetypal structure that it seems is present in the play, at least somewhat piecemeal, that it functions as a way to kind of organize the different elements of morality around this mythological structure. Now, what's really interesting in King Lear in terms of the temporal setting, so you have a drama that is essentially taking place in a pre-Christian mythological era, but the authors and the audience and kind of the mental space of the people who are participating with the play itself are in a post-Christian mythological era. And so there's a really interesting intermingling of these two ideas. And so we're going to have to kind of look at and understand, okay, what are the mythological archetypes and structures of pre-Christian understanding, and what are some post-Christian mythological archetypes and structures, particularly in the Elizabethan era, and the understanding of the structure of cosmology. And so we'll look at the two, what might appear to be paradoxical or competing cosmologies, and actually see how they sort of support one another in a single archetypal structure. And then we'll use that structure and kind of map the characters onto it and determine, okay, who is a good character and who is a bad character in this story. So I want to talk about some of the key points that I basically just went over. So morality is defined by mythological structure and drama. So how do we know how morality is how we should act? How are we supposed to act? And so one of the best ways for people to figure out how to act is to watch other people and see what they do. So if I want to know if I'm a student and I want to figure out, okay, how am I supposed to wait to go to the bathroom? Well, I watch the other students and I watch what the teacher does and says, and I'm supposed to stand against a wall and I'm supposed to stand in a line, and I wait for one student to come out of the bathroom. And if I'm in class, okay, how do I ask a question appropriately? Well, I watch what the other students do, and I watch the behaviors of the teacher, and all of my learned behavior comes about from watching what other people do and then paying attention to kind of the consequences of their action, good or bad, and then I evaluate those consequences and say, okay, yes, that's what I want, or no, that's what I don't want, and I do the things that I think will get me what I want, and I don't do the things that I think will prevent me from getting what I want, ideally as best as I can. And then I'm constantly re-evaluating, okay, are my actions actually leading to the consequences that I want? So morality, in this sense, defining it as how one should act in the world, is best portrayed in the form of a drama, because a drama is literally people acting on a stage that you watch. And so a really good way to teach people about the linking of consequences and action is to perform these dramas. And the mythological drama and this kind of archetypal drama is basically saying, okay, if you average all of the experiences of a human being within their environment, the things that they will encounter, kind of distill down into particular characters, then you can make some statements about how you should act and how you shouldn't act in the world as a natural fact of how the world is. And you sort of give dramatic characters to all of those things, and you act out the drama, and you can just see, okay, these actions led to these consequences and they were good. These actions led to these consequences, they were bad. We want the good consequences, so we're going to do those things. We don't want the bad consequences, so we're not going to do those things. And it should not be thought of as rigid rules in the sense that just take my word for it, do it this way. You could go and live your life and learn solely from experience. Don't pay attention to any ancestral wisdom. Don't pay attention to anything that other people have learned. Don't read a single book. If you just learn everything through pure experience, you could do that, and you might come to some of the same conclusions. You might come to some different conclusions, but you're obviously going to have a richer understanding of those things that you experience, but you can't experience everything in your limited lifespan, and your environment is limited, and the amount of things that are going to happen in your life are limited, so you just can't learn everything. So you sort of have to start somewhere, some baseline of how you're going to act in the world, and then tune it as you go throughout your life, and you're having your experiences, and you're paying attention to the consequences of your action, and you're retuning and you're refining your set of moral values in order to say, okay, this is how I thought I should act before. Things didn't quite work out the way I thought, so I'm going to tweak a little bit. And this spectrum of tweaking can range from very minor changes to you experience catastrophic disaster in your life, and you have to make some overarching changes to your action. But anyways, so for the most part, morality is basically how we're acting in the world, and a good way to teach people how they should act in the world is through drama. And if you act out what I'm calling the mythological drama, then you're basically able to teach the fundamentals of the human being's position in the world and how they should be working through their environment and all the challenges and problems that come along with it, the constant threat to the sort of survival of the human being. Okay, so the battle of good versus evil is a drama that plays itself over time. Human beings participate in the drama, or this drama. This should be somewhat obvious, okay? Any point in history, at any time, just pick any date and you look and you say, okay, even if you have the most relativistic idea of morality, if you just look, you can say, okay, here are some things that are probably good, and here are some things that are probably bad, and hey, let's try to make the good things occur more, and let's try to make the bad things occur less, and we as human beings have to actually participate in these things. We can't just use wishful thinking. We can't just it's not going to go away. It's not going to fix itself. You have to sort of put the rubber to the road and say, okay, I'm going to make a difference. I'm going to go change. I'm going to participate in the drama of being a human and go out there and work for good against whatever chaotic forces might happen to be out there. So the mythological characters represent the interactions of observed patterns and forces, including human activity. So you're ready to go. You got your set of moral values. You see the good in the world. You see the bad in the world, and you're going to work for the good, and you're going to resist the bad. And well, it's just not going to go that well, because you're going to run into all of these roadblocks. You're going to run into all of these things that are essentially working against you. And some of this is nature. So from natural disasters all the way to the biology of human nature, and everything in between is going to sort of at every turn kind of erupt itself into your experience. And you have to eat, you have to sleep, you have to drink water, and health is a thing. If you have a heart attack, that's going to suddenly just destroy all thoughts of oh, I'm going to go change the world. And well, you just had a heart attack, and now you're in the hospital, and now these these sort of chaotic forces have erupted themselves into your life. And at the same time, in some sense, there's this cyclical or repeatable or predictable nature to these things. So maybe you can't predict the exact occurrence that's going to happen, but you can at least say, okay, bad things are going to happen or things are going to get in my way. How do I prepare myself? What is the posture that I should take in order to interact with and successfully overcome these patterns and forces? Desirable patterns of behavior were those which interacted with the environment in a way that led to the growth and existence across time of human civilization. Okay, this is a really important point. So, the situation of the human being is precarious and is, in some sense, more precarious in the olden times, but it has been and is always precarious. The human being is constantly under threat from a variety of external forces, and it's sort of incredible that we just don't walk down the road just stifled by anxiety to the threat of our own existence. And our understanding is that, well, we can eliminate the threat this one time, but something else is going to pop up in its place, and there's this idea of a goal of what if we can eliminate threats not just now, but all threats across time, including future threats that we may not even yet know about or can't think about. The primordial human being wants to eliminate the threat of being eaten by a tiger, not just now at this one time, but all other possible incidents of tiger attacks should be eliminated. Let's just get rid of all tiger attacks, which in some sense we've been able to accomplish as a civilization. So civilization applies this structure across time, which allows humans to sort of mitigate the threat to their existence, not just in single specific instances, but in multiple predictable instances across time. And if you're a human being and you are paying attention, you saw that acting in certain ways meant that you were less likely to get eaten by a tiger, and so you wanted the people in your society to also act that way. And so these desirable patterns of behavior, how one should act, were crystallized in these mythological dramas. Okay, so the next couple slides are just going to be a few statements, and I'm going to kind of elaborate on them. And then the later slides, I'm going to have a lot more pictures to kind of illustrate the things that I'm talking about. So I know word slides are not the most exciting thing, so bear with me. Okay, so human beings were capable of recognizing that their behaviors could have lasting effects on future success. An incredible insight by the human being is that they could do or not do something now and change the outcome or the consequence in the future. They weren't just worried about exactly what was happening in the present moment, but could say, okay, if I do this now, or if I don't do this thing, the idea of delayed gratification, then in the future, which hopefully will come, I will have a much better chance of success. Agriculture. It's storing grain for future famine. We see this a little bit in the animal world, the squirrels hiding their nuts and things like that, but for the most part, you don't see lions trying to store up carcasses in the snow in the hopes that they won't rot, so that 3 years from now, when the antelope have all run away, then they say, well, don't worry, guys, we got this big storage of frozen antelope corpses that we can go feed on until they come back. No. Human beings have said, okay, look, we can actually solve problems that we know will probably happen in the future by taking specific actions now in the present. This is moral behavior. This is behavior that leads to positive future outcomes. If we only eat half of our grain now, and save the rest, then in the future, when we don't have any grain at all, we'll have the stuff that we saved left over and we'll be able to survive. And human beings are not stupid, and they figured this out, and so they created the structures that allowed them to be successful at that. And the more successful they were, they paid attention to say, oh, this worked out well. And then they paid attention to say, well, that didn't work out too well. We all starved to death, so let's try something else. Interesting point of history, we should probably pay attention to those social and governmental structures which resulted in all of the population starving to death and say maybe we shouldn't try that in the future. Okay, the behaviors which were thought to lead the behaviors which were thought to lead to this success were crystallized in the mythological dramas. Okay, you've learned something as a culture and you need to pass it down on to the next culture. Well, now we have writing and we're able to transmit our thoughts and ideas through language. Okay, what if you don't have a written language? Well, let's act it out. Let's dramatize what we think are the most important aspects of the human experience, how to behave as a human being. Let's dramatize it, act it out, tell it in stories and rituals, and then we can pass on that knowledge from generation to generation. These crystallized patterns of behavior which were thought to be desirable can be characterized as moral, or how one is supposed to act. It's kind of a humorous coincidence that we're using drama to tell people how to act, because you act in a drama. It's this sort of obvious connection that, okay, we want to teach people how to act in the world, how to exhibit behaviors that will be beneficial. Well, how do we do that? Well, let's just act them out for them and then show them, because a drama teaches morality by linking consequences and causes. If you act this way, then this will happen. If you act this other way, then this other thing will happen. And there's some generalization that's occurring because they are archetypes, but in some sense they're distilled. It's the distilled wisdom and knowledge of human beings compressed down into one or more characters. It's not a overgeneralization in this sense. It's a hypergeneralization. The great drama. Mythological characters represent observable patterns in the interaction of humans and their environment across time. What is the human being's position in the environment? What are the challenges that he's going to face? What are the things that he's going to interact with? And knowing those sort of objective facts about the human being, how should they act in order to thrive and be successful? Characters can represent human and non-human forces, and the drama is the patterned activity between them. The pattern activity between them. A human being doesn't just live in the environment in a sort of stale sense, but constantly interacts with its environment. The tiger is constantly interacting with the sphere of experience of the human beings. It's not just one character over here and another character over here, but what's important is the interaction of the archetypes. What are they doing? Because what they are doing is representative of what we should do. Drama makes a statement about behaviors and consequences of action while positing a moral position based on consequences and their causes. It's positing a position. Now, you can agree or disagree with the position, but you better have good arguments for why you disagree with the position, because many of these mythological archetypes have been developed over thousands of years. And we will see that all of the archetypes have positive and negative characteristics. So it's not like a sort of schoolboy sense of morality where you do the good things and you avoid the bad things and nothing is going to go wrong. No, these are very complex interactions of characters that have positive and negative traits, and there's an understanding within the archetype that both the positive and the negative are constantly present, and there's this constant navigation and interaction between the positive and negative poles of the archetypes. It's not that you just swing all the way to one end, because if you do so, there's this kind of rubber band effect where the other end that has been completely ignored emerges or erupts itself into the drama. And so the difficulty of the human being is not to just avoid all the bad and focus only on the good, but navigate in a very narrow sense, narrowly navigate the two extremes. And this idea of dialogue and compromise in modern society is sort of an analogy to that, right? You don't want to be hyper on the right or hyper on the left. You want to pay attention and be open to communication and dialogue and listen to one end and listen to the other end and come to some sort of communicative compromise that navigates both positions. Again, as I mentioned before, this dramatization allows for dense transfer of information across time, the quote-unquote wisdom of the elders. If the archetypes in these dramas, in the mythological dramas, if the characters are these hyper-distilled, gained knowledge about the human being, about the environment, and about the human being's interaction with the environment, then the knowledge that's being transmitted is extremely dense. It's not just factual information. It's not just maybe mathematical information. It's not just kind of superficial information. What color are the tree leaves? Stuff like that. No, it's hyper dense information about the human being's natural experience and how the human being should be acting and should be navigating their environment. And we have to remember that this has been gained for many of these older mythologies. The knowledge has been gained through thousands of years of experience and trial and error recently, essentially. Okay, the archetypal drama is reenacted cyclically through ritual because the drama persists across time, right? If the archetypes are really archetypes, then they're always going to be present, regardless of what time period you're in, regardless of what culture you're in, because it's describing the interaction of the human being with the environment. And if you're talking about environment and that includes culture, it includes the structures that human beings create. And if we start from the stance that, okay, there are some things that are innate or natural to the human being, that they're not just a complete blank slate, but there's certain things that are hardwired into the human being. And that's a position that I'm going to take. If you want to argue with me about that, that's fine. But I believe that there are certain things that are hardwired into the human being that they start off with, regardless of whatever cultural and environmental conditioning they may go through. Okay, so these human beings have common hardwiring that is occurring. And so the culture that they sort of develop, while it obviously is different, there are certain elements that are in common. And those elements that are in common are related to the biological commonalities of all human beings. And because that is staying the same, the human beings for the most part are biologically the same across, the hundreds of thousands of years that modern human beings have been alive. So the biology is staying the same, and then so the culture is in many essences also staying the same, and their interactions, the development of the culture and the realization and interaction with the environment and the dangers that it poses, this is persistent across time. And they realized that, and they knew that they had to say, okay, we have to continue to pass on the wisdom tradition. And by ritually enacting the drama, not only do you pass on the wisdom, but you also reinforce the importance of the knowledge that is contained in the drama. By making it ritualized, then it hyper values the information that's in the drama. Now, one of the dangers of ritualization is that the drama itself becomes too hyper crystallized. So powerful mythologies are able to adapt across time to new experience and new learned information about the relationship between the human being and its environment. And so a resilient mythology will actually change and adapt. It maybe will add characters or will shift to match kind of the experiences of the particular group that is presenting and enacting the mythology. But if the danger of ritual is that the mythology itself becomes too crystallized and becomes too dogmatic, and we'll look at the concept, it becomes tyrannical, essentially, and doesn't allow for change across time. And so the mythology no longer becomes effective. The ritual no longer has value, and it sort of decays and deteriorates. And when we look at the play itself, when we look at the topic of King Lear and the character of King Lear, and we ask these questions about, okay, what are the consequences of tyrannical rule? What are the powers that overthrow tyrannical rule, that threaten tyranny? What are the effects of tyranny on other people? And how can we move from tyrannical rule to something that is a little bit better? Or in the flip side, how did we get from something that was in some sense beneficial and egalitarian, was maybe orderly but still allowed freedom, to authoritarianism and tyranny, where now there is no freedom and things have been crystallized? And we'll kind of look at that trend a little bit. So just again, a restatement: ritual embodies the moral code of conduct that is desirable. Now, it's mythological, it's archetypal. It's not, let's act out a drama where people shake hands and say please and thank you and tell each other how to be polite. It's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is morality in the sense of acting in the world in a way that is effective in terms of being successful by the valuing of the society, by the valuing of the human race, I guess would be one way of thinking about it. The morality is deeply dependent upon the valuing of particular elements of the environment, valuing of particular traits of the human being, and what are the traits that have allowed human beings to be successful over time. And okay, maybe politeness is one of those traits, but I'm not necessarily convinced. But there are traits that you could say that in almost any time period, anywhere, these particular characteristics are extremely beneficial to the human being, and that's how they should be acting. Okay, so all the world's a stage. So in order for us to understand a little bit about these mythologies, we want to get inside the head of the kind of cosmology of not modern man. Okay, so we have a deep understanding of the physical nature and structure of the universe, at least we think we do. We at least have a sense of the position of the Earth within our galaxy and within the universe, and we kind of understand that the Earth is just one planet among many, and our sun is one star among many, and the whole thing is this sort of chaotic expanse, but also ordered at the same time. Well, this obviously is not how ancient people first thought. In their cosmology and how they thought about the place of the Earth and the place of the human being within the larger cosmos was extremely important for how they developed their mythologies, and thus it's also extremely important for us to understand the mythologies as well. So we got to kind of put ourselves mentally into their position. So it's an interesting diagram here, and I'm going to kind of just try to point out some important things that are relevant to us. Now, well, there's a lot of information that I may just kind of gloss over because it's not necessarily relevant, and I just kind of want to focus on the pieces that are relevant for the moral structure that we're creating, kind of the argument that I'm making. So we have a flat Earth. Okay, don't YouTube flat Earth. You might not necessarily get what it is that we're looking at here. Okay, but the ancient people thought that the Earth was a flat disk surrounded by water, and underneath it is the underground or the underworld, and on top of it is the air and the sky, and which contain the sun and the stars and all sorts of things. So there's some important, I'm going to point out the most important elements here. Okay, so the first important element to understand is that there's two types of water. There is the water that is good, the water that is life-giving. These are things that are waters, lakes, streams, anything that's fresh water, because if you pay attention and you observed and you're an ancient human being, you'd say, oh, things that grow need fresh water. You can just watch that over time, and that can be learned experience, and now you know fresh water good because makes things grow. It seems very simple, but it's kind of a profound learning, and you can kind of crystallize that knowledge. And then the opposite is true. We have here the chaotic waters, that surround the world, and there's a lot of mythologies that talk about the separating of the waters of chaos from everything else, basically. Everything else that's good and helps human beings live. And the chaotic waters are really bad. And if you think about, if you're an early human and you encounter an ocean, you'd be like, oh my gosh, what the heck is that thing? And it's not good for plants. There's huge creatures in it, probably. The salt in it, is not good. You can't drink the water. You tried to drink it, probably some human did, try to drink it and make you throw up or maybe even kill you, depending on how much you drunk. So the poison water, if you ever watch Game of Thrones, the horsemen, I'm blanking on their name right now, but they called it the poison water, right? Because the horses can't drink it, they can't drink it, they can't go over it because it's so deep, and it's this horribly deadly thing that you want to avoid, okay? And it's chaotic. Storms is there, and if you ever got caught in it, you're basically dead, so you definitely don't want to get caught out in it in some tiny boat. And so it's very bad. You want to stay away from it, and you want to keep it away. So the chaotic, evil water is the salt water. And we'll come back to this idea of chaos being pushed out by the ordered kind of world here. So we have the fresh water and we have the chaotic water. And then we have earth right here in the middle. Okay? And we see this kind of pyramidal structure, and it's very interesting because the idea is that as you go up, you go more into the heavens. So we kind of already see this idea of the human being as either pushing up towards into heaven, or at least being the highest pinnacle point on earth in relation to the heavens. And we'll come back to this analogy as the human being as representative of the divine order that is on earth. We want to remember that anything within the sphere is considered orderly because it has been ordered in structure and has a particular pattern to it. And then underneath here is the underworld. In the underworld, if you're dead, you go here, and there's some other kind of mythology pieces around it. But basically, you want to understand that it's still part of the orderly structure that has been placed into the sort of void of chaos, represented by the ocean water, or the salt water. Okay, so here's kind of a text of what I'm trying to say. So the outermost area are the waters of chaos, the ocean and the salt water. And we can think of this as the area that is unknown and unexplored. It's dangerous because you don't know what's out there. And it's dangerous because what erupts into your life is going to be novel and brand new, and you're not going to know how to deal with it. Mythologically, this most frequently appears as a feminine element. The waters under the earth, or the life-giving waters, the rivers, the lakes, these are the things in nature that are known. There's order to it. They're predictable. You think about the Nile floods, okay? The Nile flooded at a very predictable cycle. And so this was a part of nature that was known, and human beings could make plans around it, and in some sense that was good. It allowed them to interact with and manipulate their environment in a way that was extremely successful. As opposed to the outer waters, which are unknown, and therefore you can't interact with it. It's so unknowable that it's beyond the boundary. In some sense, it's truly transcendent because there's no way of actually knowing what it is. As soon as it erupts into the field of human experience, then it becomes what's known. Now, it still might be dangerous. It's an encounter with the unknown, but in some sense, it's transformed from what was previously unknown into what is known, as long as you can survive that encounter. And that's not so easy to do, as we will learn in this myth. Okay, nature, we're talking about the earth itself here, paired in some sense with the waters of life. And it has this creative principle to it. It bursts and things grow from it. And so it's considered feminine as well. A really interesting twist. I was doing some research kind of a little bit before I started this. There, in Egyptian mythology, there's one, the cosmology is in some sense reversed. So typically the sky and the sky god is considered masculine, and the earth and the sustaining of the earth is considered feminine. But in this particular cosmology is actually reversed, and the sky is actually the female body which is bound across, and then the earth underneath it is the male body. And then the myth goes that they were essentially copulating, and one of the mythological gods disapproved, and so he kind of comes in between them and separates them, and the space that is created in between them is the air and the sky and the earth that kind of people live on and interact with. And I thought it was very interesting that the genders are flipped, and I don't really understand why that is. Perhaps somebody more knowledgeable than me can inform me of that. Okay, the threat of chaos. The waters on the outside here, constantly threatening the human experience. The human experience is one of constant danger from things that they don't know. Unanticipated experiences that threaten the safety, the well-being, and even the life of the individual. This would have been a very obvious thing for early human beings, and in some sense we're protected from that idea, but in our own lives we know that there's always these things that we can't account for that are constantly getting in our way, and it could be a minor inconvenience. You can't find a pen or a pencil when we need to, or it could be something more catastrophic. You have a major car crash on your way to work, and now all of a sudden you have to deal with all of these things that none of which you sort of anticipated. And so chaos is always erupting itself into our lives, and the people who wrote these mythologies realized that and knew that, and it was kind of the most important thing to be able to manage this chaos that was constantly threatening you. So chaos they're unknown elements of nature and the cosmos that threaten human order and safety. What is the purpose of human order? To keep at bay the forces of chaos that are constantly threatening to overthrow us. Chaos is represented as the destructive water. Now, there's an interesting transformation that happens, because chaos can also be represented as a dragon, and a lot of times these symbols are collapsed into each other. There's a Genesis tradition of the Leviathan. Okay, so it's this water dragon, the water serpent, the big snake associated with the water. And depending on the particular cultural narratives and the location of the cultural narrative and time and space, the nature of the dragon shifts and changes. But really the essence of it is that it's this chimeric monster that represents the totality of the unknown and those things that are transcendent beyond the human experience. If we're a human being and we are observing not just what's happening now, but making inferences about what happens over time and across time, and we're able to pay attention to cyclical patterns and recurring events across time, we realize that chaos itself, in some sense, is the power that both creates and destroys. That death comes to everything, everything is destroyed, and so the passage of time is dangerous to the human being because the passage of time consumes the human being. No human being ever survives the passage of time. 100% guarantee, I promise you that. Okay, no human being listening to this lecture is going to survive the passage of time. So, that was dangerous. That was part of kind of the transcendent reality of the human being's experience. Time passed, things were consumed. And we're going to see this as typically a female principle, but not necessarily. But I'm looking at it in the particular way of the snake, the serpent, which represents chaos, which also consumes itself. Perpetual snake goddess of time, which creates and destroys the natural world. And this is kind of the symbol that we're dealing with here. Okay, so the transcendent reality of time that consumes itself, that's a destructive threat, but is ever present, and because it's time itself, it's in some sense eternal as well. we start to see emerge here then that this snake of time is also the goddess. So there is a creative, sustaining versus the destructive power of time. So if you observe the natural world, you see that things naturally grow over time, but you see that things also naturally decay and destroy. And these two poles, the positive and the negative pole, can in some sense be symbolized all the way back to the notion of the life-giving and the destructive waters. The salt water versus the fresh water. And you can think of it as these concentric circles where the last border of human knowledge and human experience is the border of the goddess, the fresh water, nature, which is in some sense understandable in its cyclical and creative power and in its cyclical destructive power. And then just beyond that border is the transcendent, the dragon, which is totally unknowable and totally non-understandable. That's why it's transcendent. It cannot be comprehended until it erupts itself past the line into the actual experience of the human being. So the goddess, or the feminine principle, represents both the known parts of nature and the unknown parts of nature. The unknown feminine is chaos and is threatening until it becomes known. As soon as the unknown begins to emerge into the realm of experience, then the human being can interact with it. And by interacting with it, they know what it is, and in some sense they can subdue it or defeat it or make it useful or purposeful for the human beings. Known is good because it's generative and creative and supports the things that human beings do, like hunting and agriculture. You need nature in order to hunt. You need nature in order to do agriculture. But you don't need nature to be wholly destructive and so untamable and controllable that you're not able to predict what it's going to do. So you want known nature. You want the feminine principle that supports the things that human being wants to do. So we're going to look at this as the symbol of the virgin that lives at the intersection of nature and culture. What the virgin does is the virgin sees, this is a very important concept that we'll come to later, the virgin sees the unknown for what it really is. The virgin, the ordered nature, is able to identify chaos, unknowable chaos, and say, this is what it is. Pay attention. Look, I see what it is. Points it out to the hero, who we'll look at, who's able to subdue it through knowledge. The hero could not defeat chaos if they didn't know what chaos was. It was totally unknowable and uninteractable with. There would be no way to sort of incorporate it into the realm of human experience. But the virgin who sees the unknown chaos for what it is, provides the necessary structure to it, points it out to the hero, who's able to subdue it and use it for useful purposes for the human being through the new knowledge that they've gained. Okay, here's one particular image that I think pretty much encapsulates that entire idea. It's a wonderful painting of the story of St. George and the dragon, excuse me. So, on the left here, we have the virgin that St. George is rescuing. And what's fascinating here is the leash that is on the dragon. So again, the dragon is representing chaos here. So the virgin over here is pointing out what chaos is. It's provided structure to the dragon. The dragon is all flying around and being crazy, and St. George would have no chance. So he needs the virgin to point out and sort of provide the necessary knowledge in order to defeat the dragon. And then George kind of defeats the dragon as kind of a symbol of overcoming the chaos. And there's a couple of really other interesting features to this painting, which I'll sort of touch on here. So this black smoke in this spiral pattern, okay, often symbolizes the notion, in the forest as well, there's the notion of this part here, George, is kind of the iceberg, tip of the iceberg ego that performs the action, but is supported by the larger psyche back here, which is represented by the deep forest and the black smoke here. And this gets a lot into kind of Jungian psychology and other sort of contemporary studies of mythology and its relation to the deep psyche of the human being, which I'm not really going to get into. But it's just important to notice that all the pieces of the puzzle are here. You have the hero, the representative of social order, right? It's the patron saint of England, the very monarchical, hierarchical structure that provides safety and order to all of the human beings. And you have the dragon of chaos, which threatens that order. You have the virgin, who's sort of ironically being rescued, but is actually the one holding the dragon on the leash so that George, the hero, can slay it. Here's a really interesting picture of the creative or sustaining goddess. So we have the sustaining goddess basically sustaining all of the things that make up creation. And then we have its counterpart, the destructive goddess. This is a really wonderful picture here. So there's so many cool elements to this picture. So one of the things we see the heads, severed heads, and the severed hands of kind of the sort of eternal destruction of time. Nobody escapes time, and so time is going to come in and chop your head off and chop your arms off, and that's just the reality of the situation. And we see she's standing on this human being, and this is actually a Hindu deity as well. I'm not going to go into too much that, but we also see this snake coiled around his arm and is still alive. And so we see hints of the serpent present in this icon as well. And we also see the sort of radiant power of the deity. And we'll kind of mention later the talk of like the sun power and the solar deities and things like that and how they relate. But again, we have, okay, the whole picture is right here. You can just look at this picture and understand everything about mythology and mythological archetypes just by studying this picture, basically. Okay, and this is the creative or generative nature of the goddess, and then this is the destructive nature of the goddess. And we see wings, okay, we see snakes, right? So these are important symbols. Wings, the dragon is a winged snake. We see the kind of curled tail here. Okay, and the fact that time has slain a hero is somewhat important as well. Okay, next time what we're going to do is we're going to come and learn about the male principle. So we focused solely on the female principle as chaotic nature, but also beneficial and creative nature. So those would have been huge realms of experience for the human being. In some sense, less so now. We're so detached or disassociated from the natural world because of the way that we've structured our society, but particularly for the cultures that would have been developing these early mythological archetypes and these early mythologies, the natural world played a huge important role in the experience of the human being. So now what we're going to move to is the male principle, and the male principle is the ordering principle, basically the interaction of human society with nature. What do human beings sort of need to add structure to in order to make sure that they're not going to be completely overwhelmed by nature? And so that's what we'll look at next time.